I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a retired construction inspector, I spent my entire life building strong foundations, only to discover that my own home was hiding a devastating secret. Last Sunday, my neighbor yelled at me furious about my grandkids crying loudly every single night. The problem is, my wife passed away 5 years ago, my only daughter is unmarried, and I do not have any grandchildren. I told him he was crazy, but his answer made my blood run cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. Now let me take you back to the exact moment my peaceful retirement shattered into a million pieces. The afternoon sun was just beginning to dip behind the old oak trees as I pulled my truck into the driveway of my home in suburban Pennsylvania. I was exhausted. I had just returned from a quiet weekend golf trip with some old buddies up near Lake Erie. It was the kind of trip a man my age looks forward to: a few days of fresh air, bad golf swings, and silence. Since my wife passed away 5 years ago, this large colonial house had felt incredibly empty. I had spent 40 years inspecting concrete and steel, ensuring buildings would not collapse, and I had poured that same dedication into maintaining this home. It was supposed to be my peaceful sanctuary for my final years. I turned off the engine, listening to the familiar sound of the cooling machinery ticking under the hood. I took a deep breath, ready to head inside, unpack my duffel bag, and settle into my armchair for the evening. But before I could even get my door fully open, I heard the heavy, rapid crunch of boots marching across the gravel. I looked up. It was Gary. Gary is 68 years old, a retired military veteran who lives in the house directly across the street. He is a notoriously difficult man. He rarely sleeps, spends most of his nights sitting on his front porch in the dark, and complains about everything from the length of my lawn grass to the way the mailman parks his truck. I usually try to give him a friendly wave and avoid getting pulled into his daily grievances. But today, Gary was not just complaining. He was furious. His face was flushed red, and the veins in his neck were standing out as he marched right up to the driver's side window of my truck. "Richard." He barked, his voice rough and loud enough to echo down the quiet suburban street. "You need to get your house in order right now. You need to tell your grandkids to shut their mouths at night." I am sick and tired of it. I sat there, my hand frozen on the steering wheel, completely confused. I stared at him for a long moment, trying to process the words coming out of his mouth. "Gary," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady, "what on earth are you talking about? I just got back from a 3-day trip. The house has been totally empty." "Do not play dumb with me, Richard," Gary snapped, leaning closer to my window. "Do not insult my intelligence. They are waking me up at 2 in the morning, night after night. The crying, the muffled screaming, the thumping against the walls. It echoes straight across the street into my bedroom window. You need to control those kids." A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell between us. I slowly stepped out of the truck, closing the door behind me. I looked Gary dead in the eye, feeling a mixture of pity and annoyance. I knew Gary was getting older, and sometimes isolation plays tricks on the mind. "Gary," I said, gently lowering my voice, "you know my wife died 5 years ago. You came to the funeral. And you know my daughter, Natalie. She is 35 years old. She is a real estate agent. She is practically married to her job. She does not have a husband. She does not even have a boyfriend that I know of, and she absolutely does not have any children. I do not have any grandkids, Gary. There are no children in my house. You must be hearing a television from another neighbor, or maybe foxes crying in the woods out back." Gary did not back down. Instead, his eyes narrowed and a cold, hard expression washed over his face. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Foxes do not wear pajamas, Richard," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And televisions do not get carried out of black SUVs in the dead of night." I froze. A strange, cold prickle began to crawl up the back of my neck. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Gary stepped closer, pointing a weathered finger directly at my chest. I said, "I see your daughter carrying them in every night. Do not stand there and tell me she is not." Every single night this week around 2 in the morning, her black SUV pulls up to the curb. She kills the headlights, parks in the shadow of the big oak tree, and she unloads them. Little bundles. Kids. Sometimes they are crying, sometimes they are completely limp like they are sleepwalking. She carries them straight down your driveway and takes them right into your basement. The air in my lungs suddenly felt entirely too thin. The crisp Pennsylvania afternoon felt suffocating. I wanted to yell at him. I wanted to tell him he was out of his mind, that he needed to get his eyes checked, that he was making up vicious lies about my hard-working daughter. Natalie was a successful professional. She wore designer suits, closed million-dollar deals, and always made time to bring her old father herbal tea in the evenings to help him sleep. She was the perfect daughter. But my mind, trained by 40 years of inspecting structures for hidden flaws, immediately began looking for the cracks in the foundation of my own life. My house was built on a slope. The front door was on the ground level, but the rear of the house sloped downward, exposing a large private entrance to the basement at the end of the driveway. Years ago, that basement was my personal woodworking shop. I had insulated the walls heavily. I had soundproofed the ceiling. I had installed a heavy steel security door down there to protect my expensive power tools. And most importantly, I had installed an electronic keypad lock on that heavy steel door. I stared at Gary, the blood slowly draining from my face. My mind was racing, trying to find any logical explanation to dismiss his claims. But a terrifying, undeniable fact slammed into my chest with the force of a freight train. I am the only person who lives in this house. But there is one other person who knows the 6-digit code to the basement door. Natalie. I looked past Gary, my eyes drifting down the sloping asphalt of my driveway, staring at the side of the house that led to the basement entrance. The area was perfectly shielded from the streetlights. It was a massive blind spot. If someone parked a vehicle there in the middle of the night, no one would see them. No one except a neighbor who sits awake on his porch in the dark. Jonathan. Gary watched the color fade from my face. He slowly uncrossed his arms, his anger seemingly replaced by a grim sense of validation. "I am not crazy, Richard," Gary said quietly, his voice lacking its previous aggression. "I was a spotter in the military. I know what I see in the dark. You better figure out what your daughter is doing down there before somebody else does." Without another word, Gary turned around and walked slowly back across the street, his boots crunching loudly against the asphalt. He climbed the steps to his porch, went inside, and shut his door. I stood perfectly still in my driveway for a very long time. The evening breeze rustled the leaves above my head, but I could not feel the cold. I could only feel a deep, sickening knot tightening in my stomach. The silence of my property, which had always brought me peace, now felt heavy and threatening. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. I thought about the hot cups of herbal tea Natalie had been bringing me every evening for the last 3 months. She always insisted I drink every last drop, claiming it was a special blend to cure my insomnia. I thought about how deeply I slept after drinking it. Heavy, dreamless sleep. The kind of sleep where a person would never hear a black SUV pulling into the driveway. The kind of sleep where a person would never hear the keypad beeping. The kind of sleep where a person would never hear crying children just a few feet below his own bedroom floor. I slowly turned and looked toward the basement entrance again. The shadows were growing longer, creeping toward the heavy steel door. I did not want to believe it. My heart screamed that Gary was lying, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the instincts of an old inspector were completely awake now. I knew there was only one way to find out the truth. I had to go inside. I had to go downstairs. And I had to pray to God that my neighbor was wrong. I stepped away from the driveway, my legs feeling heavier than they had in years. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I made my way to the front door, each step echoing the terrifying accusation Gary had just hurled at me. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet foyer of my home. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood greeted me, a scent that had always meant safety. But right now, the silence of the house felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I dropped my duffel bag by the coat rack. My eyes immediately drifted toward the hallway that led to the interior basement door. I took one step toward it, then another. My hand reached out, hovering just inches over the brass doorknob. I wanted to turn it. I wanted to march down those wooden stairs, flip on the harsh fluorescent lights, and tear the place apart, until I found whatever truth was hiding in the dark. But my hand stopped. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive and successful through decades of dangerous construction sites, kicked in. If Gary was right, if my daughter was truly sneaking people into my house at 2 a.m, going down there now would be a catastrophic mistake. If I moved something, if I left a footprint in the dust, if I disturbed whatever system she had set up, I would tip her off. I would lose the element of surprise. And more importantly, Natalie was due to arrive in less than 2 hours. It was a Sunday evening tradition. Every Sunday, without fail, my beautiful, successful daughter would come over to check on her old man, make us a light dinner, and brew me a special cup of tea. I pulled my hand away from the doorknob. I had to play this perfectly. I had to look her in the eye and see if the daughter I raised was truly capable of being a monster. At exactly 6:30, the front door chimed. I heard the lock turn. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair in the living room, a newspaper draped over my lap, pretending to read. The door swung open, and in walked Natalie. She looked exactly as she always did. Perfect. She was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp white blouse, and a soft, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She carried a canvas tote bag filled with fresh groceries in one hand and her sleek leather briefcase in the other. "Hi, Dad," she called out, her voice bright and melodic, cutting through the heavy silence of the house. "I missed you this weekend. How was the fishing trip? Did you catch anything or just catch up on sleep?" She walked over and leaned down, kissing me gently on the cheek. She smelled of expensive vanilla perfume and fresh rain. My stomach twisted into a violent, painful knot. I forced myself to smile back, a monumental effort that made my facial muscles ache. "It was quiet, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. "Just an old man sitting by the water. I am glad to be back in my own chair." She laughed, a warm, comforting sound that had brought me so much joy over the past 35 years. She patted my shoulder and walked into the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she began to unpack the groceries. I watched her from my chair. I watched the way she moved, so confident and relaxed in my home. How could this be the same woman Gary described? How could this elegant, caring professional be dragging children into a dark basement in the middle of the night? It had to be a mistake. But then the ritual began. I listened to the sounds coming from the kitchen. The gentle clinking of porcelain mugs, the rushing water from the faucet filling the electric kettle, the familiar snap of the burner turning on. For the past 3 months, ever since I casually mentioned to her that I was having trouble sleeping through the night, Natalie had taken it upon herself to cure my insomnia. She had brought over a special blend of loose-leaf herbal tea. She swore it was an old homeopathic remedy she found at a specialty wellness shop downtown. Every time she visited, she brewed it for me. And every night she did not visit, she left a prepared thermos of it in the fridge, insisting I drink it before bed. I sat in my leather chair, my heart pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I started doing the math. I am a 70-year-old man. For the last 5 years, I have been a notoriously light sleeper. A dog barking 3 streets over would wake me up. The wind rattling the window panes would keep me up for hours. But for the last 90 days, ever since that tea became a part of my nightly routine, my nights had been entirely blank. I would drink the warm, slightly bitter liquid around 9 o'clock. By 9:30, my eyelids would feel like they were made of lead. I would barely make it to my bed before collapsing into a deep, dreamless void. and I would not open my eyes again until the morning sun was glaring through my curtains at 8 o'clock. I had thanked her for it. I had actually thanked her for giving me my rest back. Now sitting in the fading evening light, the realization hit me with a sickening wave of nausea. She was not curing my insomnia. She was neutralizing a threat. She was making sure the security guard of this house was unconscious. "Dad, I brought your favorite mug," she called out from the kitchen. A moment later, she walked into the living room, holding a steaming ceramic mug in her hands. She carefully set it down on the wooden coaster on the side table next to my chair. A thin wisp of steam curled up into the air, carrying the faint, earthy scent of chamomile, and something else, something slightly metallic and bitter, that I had previously ignored. "Drink it while it is hot, Dad," she said softly, her eyes filled with what looked exactly like genuine concern. "You look exhausted from your trip. You need a good long night of sleep." I looked at the mug. Then I looked up at my daughter. Her face was perfectly composed. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no nervous twitch in her eye. If she was poisoning her own father, she was doing it with the cold, calculated precision of a sociopath. "Thank you, Natalie," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached out and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic. "You are always taking such good care of me. What would I do without you?" She smiled, stepping back and brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "That is what family is for, Dad. I'm going to put away the rest of these groceries, and then I have to head back to my place. I have a massive stack of paperwork to get through tonight for a commercial property closing tomorrow." I nodded, bringing the mug close to my lips. I blew on the hot liquid, letting the bitter steam wash over my face. I tilted the mug, pressing the rim against my bottom lip, but I kept my mouth tightly closed. I let the hot ceramic rest there for a moment, pretending to take a long, satisfying sip. I lowered the mug and let out a soft sigh as if the warmth was already soothing my tired bones. Natalie watched me for a second, her smile widening just a fraction. Satisfied that I had consumed the first dose, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchen. The second her back was completely turned, I moved with a speed I did not know I still possessed. Next to my armchair sat a massive, densely potted Boston fern that my late wife had planted years ago. I leaned over, silently tilted the mug, and poured the dark, steaming liquid directly into the dry soil at the base of the plant. The soil drank it up instantly, hiding the evidence deep within its roots. I quickly brought the mug back to my lap, leaving just a tiny sip at the bottom, just in time for Natalie to walk back into the room holding her briefcase. "All done," she said cheerfully. "You finished that tea, Dad. I will call you tomorrow afternoon to check in." I held up the nearly empty mug, forcing a tired, grateful smile. "I will be asleep before you even get home, sweetheart. Drive safe." She walked over, kissed my forehead, and headed for the front door. I listened to the deadbolt click into place as she left. I listened to her footsteps walk down the front steps. I listened to the engine of her car start up and fade away down the street. The house fell completely silent once again. But this time it was different. This time the silence was not peaceful. It was a battlefield waiting for the war to begin. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the front door, double-checking the lock. I walked through the kitchen, the dining room, and the hallways, turning off every single light in the house. I plunged the entire first floor into total, suffocating darkness. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my leather armchair. I did not turn on the television. I did not pick up a book. I simply sat there in the pitch black. I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. The glowing hands pointed to 8:15. I leaned my head back against the leather chair, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark. My mind was completely clear, completely sharp, and completely focused. I was not going to sleep tonight. I was going to sit right here, completely awake in the dead silence of my own home. And I was going to wait for 2 in the morning. Sitting in the pitch black of my living room, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock felt like a hammer striking against my skull. Every passing second dragged me closer to 2 in the morning. My eyes adjusted to the heavy darkness tracing the familiar outlines of the wooden furniture I had built with my own hands decades ago. I needed to keep my mind sharp. I needed to stay completely awake. So I forced myself to replay the evening in my head. I forced myself to rewind the tape to just a few hours ago, right before Natalie walked out the front door. I needed to dissect every word she said, every breath she took, and every lie she spun. I remembered sitting in this exact chair, holding that steaming mug of poisoned tea, pretending everything was perfectly normal. Natalie had just finished packing away the remaining groceries in the kitchen and was zipping up her leather briefcase. I knew I had to test her. I had to throw a stone into the dark water and see if she caused a ripple. I kept my voice incredibly casual, adopting the mild tone of a tired old man, making idle neighborhood gossip. "Natalie," I had said, resting the mug on my knee. "You know Gary from across the street? I ran into him in the driveway today. I think the poor guy is finally losing his mind. He was ranting and raving about the craziest things." Natalie had paused. Her hand stopped midway up the zipper of her briefcase. It was a microscopic hesitation, the kind of brief pause only a father who had watched her grow for 35 years would ever notice. But then she smoothed it over beautifully. She let out a soft, sympathetic sigh and turned to face me. "Oh, really?" she asked, her voice laced with perfect manufactured concern. "What is he going on about now? Did the mailman step on his grass again?" I forced a dry chuckle, shaking my head slowly. "No much worse this time," I replied. "He was yelling at me about children. He told me he has been seeing little kids being carried into my house in the middle of the night. He even said he saw your SUV parked outside. I told him he needs to see a doctor. The isolation is getting to him." I stared directly into her eyes as I delivered the bait. I waited for a flinch. I waited for a single drop of sweat, a nervous swallow, or a sudden shift in her posture. There was absolutely nothing. The daughter I raised did not even blink. Instead, she let out a bright musical laugh that echoed softly off the living room walls. It was a laugh so genuine, so entirely devoid of guilt, that for a split second I actually felt ashamed for doubting her. "Dad." "That is incredibly sad," she had said, walking over and resting a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You know he has not been the same since his wife left him. Dementia does terrible things to the brain. He is probably hallucinating or confusing reality with old television shows." She squeezed my shoulder gently, the picture of a compassionate neighbor. As for my car, she continued smoothly transitioning into her alibi, without missing a single beat. "You know I have been working insane hours lately. I am trying to close that massive commercial park deal downtown. I have been leaving the office well past midnight some nights. Sometimes I drive through this neighborhood on my way home just to make sure your lights are off and you are getting some rest. I guess Gary saw my car passing by, and his confused brain filled in the rest with some crazy story about kids. You should just ignore him, Dad. He is not living in reality anymore." It was a flawless explanation. It accounted for everything. It provided a logical reason for her car being in the area late at night. It completely discredited Gary as a reliable witness, and it painted her as a hard-working, caring daughter who was simply looking out for her elderly father. If I had been anyone else, I would have accepted it without a second thought. I would have drank my tea, gone to sleep, and let the monsters operate freely in my basement. But I was not anyone else. I was a man who had spent 4 decades inspecting the ground people walked on. As Natalie turned away to pick up her briefcase, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room window had caught the bottom of her shoe. She was wearing a pair of expensive black designer heels. They were immaculate, polished to a high shine, the kind of shoes a high-powered real estate agent wears to luxury high-rise offices and expensive steakhouse dinners. But right there, caked thick against the back of the heel and smeared deeply into the arch of the sole, was a heavy clump of dried dirt. It was not just any dirt. It was a very specific, vibrant shade of rust red. In my 40 years as a commercial construction inspector, I had evaluated thousands of foundation plots across this entire state. I know the soil composition of this city better than I know the back of my own hand. The soil in our quiet suburban neighborhood is rich dark loam. The soil around her luxury high-rise office downtown is mostly gray gravel and sandy fill. That bright rust-colored clay only exists in one specific area of the county. It is a heavy, dense clay that sticks to everything it touches like wet cement, and it is only found deep in the industrial district on the far south side of the city. The South Side Industrial District is a sprawling wasteland of abandoned factories, rundown warehouses, and dilapidated chain-link fences. It is a place where streetlights have been broken for years, where the roads are cracked and crumbling, and where desperate people go when they have nowhere else to turn. It is not a place for luxury real estate development. It is not a place for expensive black heels. There is absolutely no reason for a successful corporate agent to be walking through that toxic red clay mud unless she was hiding something entirely disconnected from her professional life. Sitting in the dark now, the memory of that red clay burned in my mind like a warning beacon. She had lied right to my face. She had stood in my living room smelling of expensive vanilla perfume and fed me a carefully rehearsed script. She was not working late at a pristine corporate office. She was trudging through the mud of the worst neighborhood in the city, dragging something or someone back to my house. The realization was a physical blow. It felt as though all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the room. My daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the woman whose college tuition I had paid for with years of back-breaking labor, was living a dangerous double life. The elegant real estate agent was a mask. Underneath it was a stranger who was cold enough to drug her own father every single night to use his home as a staging ground for something unspeakable. I rubbed my temples, trying to ease the throbbing pain building behind my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping together. Gary was not crazy. The tea was not for my health, and the children were real. I did not know who they were. I did not know where she was getting them from, and I did not know why she was bringing them into my basement. But the red clay proved that whatever she was doing, it was rooted in the darkest, most desperate corners of the city. I was no longer dealing with a daughter making a mistake. I was dealing with a criminal operating under my roof. I looked back at the glowing face of the grandfather clock. It was nearly midnight. 2 hours left. 2 hours until the black SUV would glide silently down my driveway. 2 hours until I would find out exactly what kind of monster my daughter had become. I checked the heavy cylinder of my old revolver, feeling the cold steel against my fingertips, and I waited for the nightmare to begin. The hours between midnight and 2 in the morning are the longest a man can endure. I sat frozen in my worn leather armchair, enveloped in the suffocating darkness, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. Staying awake through the night is a brutal battle for a 70-year-old man, but the adrenaline made sleep impossible. My joints ached and my eyes burned from staring into the shadows. I took slow breaths to keep my heart rate steady. I had spent hours waiting for concrete to cure on construction sites, but this waiting was different. I was waiting for my entire reality to shatter into pieces. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the heavy silence of the neighborhood finally broke. It was a rhythmic sound, imperceptible to anyone asleep. But to me, sitting in the dark with every sense dialed to its limit, it sounded like an earthquake. It was the crunch of rubber tires rolling over the loose gravel of my driveway. The sound sent a violent shockwave down my spine. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. I slowly pushed myself up from the deep leather of my armchair. I navigated the familiar layout of my living room by memory, taking careful steps across the hardwood floor to avoid the creaking boards. I reached the front window overlooking the driveway. My hands were trembling. I gripped the sill. I pressed my face close to the glass, parting 2 slats of the blinds, just enough to see out into the night. The street outside was bathed in the orange glow of municipal streetlights. Just as Gary had described, a shadow was moving along the curb. It was a black SUV gliding down the street with its headlights turned off. The vehicle angled toward my property tires, crunching softly as it rolled down the slope of my driveway. It bypassed the front entrance and continued down the side of the house, creeping toward the lower level. I watched as the vehicle pulled into the blind spot, cast by the oak tree in my side yard. It was positioned where no neighbor or police cruiser could ever see it. The engine cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. My breathing fogged the glass of the window, and I had to wipe it away with my hand to keep my line of sight clear. A moment later, the driver's side door clicked open. A figure stepped out into the humid night air. Even in the dense shadows, I recognized the posture and silhouette immediately. It was Natalie. But the elegant real estate agent who had kissed my cheek earlier was gone. She was dressed in dark clothing, her hair pulled back tightly under a black baseball cap. She moved with a sharp, nervous energy, scanning the street behind her. She walked to the rear of the SUV and popped the trunk. A faint cargo light flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the driveway. I strained my eyes against the cold glass. She reached into the back of the vehicle and began dragging out heavy, awkward shapes. They were bundled in dark blankets, soft and limp. They were small, too small to be equipment. As she hauled the first bundle against her chest, a tiny pale arm slipped out from beneath the blanket, dangling lifelessly in the dim light. Pure nausea washed over me. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop the gasp trying to escape my throat. Gary was right. My daughter was carrying unconscious children into my home. I watched in horror as she carried the first bundle toward the heavy steel door of my basement. She balanced the limp weight against her hip and reached out with her free hand. I could clearly hear the rapid electronic beeping of the keypad lock. It was my code. The green access light flashed brightly in the darkness, and the heavy metallic clunk of the deadbolt retracting echoed through the yard. She pulled the heavy steel door open, the hinges groaning softly. She stepped inside, swallowed by the darkness of the lower level. A few seconds later, she emerged empty-handed. She hurried back to the trunk of the SUV, her movements frantic and purposeful, and pulled out a second bundled shape, then a third, then a fourth. Each time she carried them down the slope, disappearing into the dark maw of my basement, only to return for more. My mind was spinning. The basement of my home, the place where I had built rocking horses for this very woman when she was a little girl, was being transformed into a dungeon right beneath my feet. After the final trip, the trunk slammed shut. Natalie walked back to the basement door, stepped inside, and pulled the heavy steel door firmly shut behind her. The lock engaged with a loud click. A moment later, a faint sliver of light appeared through the small ventilation grate near the foundation. She had turned on the basement lights. She was down there with them. A sudden blinding rage erupted inside my chest, burning away the shock and fear. The instinct of a father took complete control of my mind. I spun away from the window, my breathing ragged. My eyes locked onto the heavy wooden baseball bat I kept tucked behind the front door. I grabbed the handle, the worn ashwood feeling solid and lethal in my grip. I took 3 aggressive strides toward the interior hallway door that led down to the basement stairs. I wanted to kick the door open. I wanted to charge down those wooden steps, swing that bat, and destroy whatever monstrous operation she was running. But as my hand slammed against the brass doorknob, the cold metal shocked my system. I froze. The rational inspector inside my brain screamed at me to stop. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the solid wood of the door, fighting a violent internal war. If I go down there right now, armed only with a piece of wood, I have no idea what I am walking into. I do not know if she has a weapon. I do not know if bursting through that door will cause her to panic and harm the children. I have zero evidence and no tactical advantage. I would be tipping my hand, destroying any chance of catching her in a trap. My grip on the baseball bat trembled as I slowly pulled my hand away from the doorknob. The hardest thing a man can ever do is stand still when his instincts are screaming at him to fight. But I knew to win this war, I had to be smarter than her. I backed away from the door, the wood of the bat slipping from my fingers and clattering softly against the floorboards. I retreated to my chair, staring blindly at the faint light bleeding through the floorboards beneath my feet. I forced myself to sit in the suffocating silence, breathing through the nightmare and waiting for the dawn. Dawn did not arrive with a sense of relief. It bled into the sky, slowly casting a cold, gray light through the living room windows. I had not moved from my leather armchair for over 5 hours. My body was stiff, every joint aching with a deep, persistent throb, but my mind was vibrating with a dangerous energy. At 6:30, I heard the heavy steel door of the basement open and close. I heard the faint, muffled sounds of the black SUV starting up in the side yard. I tracked the sound of the tires rolling backward up the gravel driveway, turning onto the street, and fading away into the morning commute. Natalie was gone. She had taken whatever or whoever was down there with her. I waited another full hour just to be absolutely certain she was not coming back for a forgotten item. At exactly 8 o'clock, I finally pushed myself out of the chair. My legs trembled slightly as they took my weight, but I forced them to steady. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and drank it in one long gulp. I needed to be hydrated. I needed to be sharp. I was no longer a retired old man waiting for the end of his days. I was an inspector stepping onto a compromised site. I walked down the hallway and stopped in front of the interior door that led down to the basement stairs. The brass doorknob felt freezing against my palm. I turned it, pushed the door open, and stared down into the darkness. I reached out and flicked the wall switch. The harsh, humming fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the wooden staircase. I took the first step down. The familiar scent of aged pine, dry sawdust, and machine oil rushed up to greet me. It was a smell that had always brought me peace. For 20 years, this basement had been my sanctuary. It was where I built birdhouses, rocking chairs, and eventually, the very cradle Natalie had slept in as an infant. Now that same smell made my stomach churn with nausea. I descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, avoiding the 4th and 7th steps, knowing they would creak loudly. Even though the house was empty, the instinct for stealth was overwhelming. I reached the concrete floor of the basement and stood completely still. I closed my eyes and listened. The house settled with a faint groan above me. The furnace hummed quietly in the corner. There were no whimpers. There were no cries. The basement was entirely silent. I opened my eyes and began the search. I did not rush. When you spend 4 decades inspecting structural integrity, you learn that rushing is how you miss the fatal flaw. You have to look at the space not as a whole, but as a collection of individual details. I started with the perimeter walls. I ran my hands along the heavily insulated drywall, checking for any signs of recent patching, any hollow sounds, or any disturbed dust along the baseboards. Everything was perfectly intact. I moved to the storage shelves lining the back wall. They were stacked with transparent plastic bins, holding old Christmas decorations, spare plumbing fixtures, and gardening supplies. I examined the layer of dust on the lids of the bins. It was thick and undisturbed. Nobody had moved them. Nobody had hidden anything inside them. I moved to the center of the room where my heavy woodworking equipment was stationed. My table saw my drill press, and my bandsaw stood exactly where I had left them months ago. I checked the heavy canvas tarps draped over my lumber racks. I lifted the corners, shining a small flashlight into the dark recesses beneath them. Nothing. Just cobwebs and forgotten scraps of oak. Frustration began to build in the back of my throat. I stood in the middle of the room, turning in a slow circle. The space looked completely innocent. It looked exactly like the abandoned workshop of a retired man. If a police officer were to walk down here right now, they would see absolutely nothing suspicious. Natalie was incredibly careful. She had cleaned up her tracks perfectly. But nobody is entirely perfect. Every action leaves a reaction. Every movement leaves friction. I forced myself to calm down. I closed my eyes again and pictured the black SUV in the driveway. I pictured the heavy bundled shapes she was carrying. If she brought children down here, she had to put them somewhere. She could not just leave them lying on the cold concrete. She needed a space that was concealed, a space that was secure, and a space that would muffle any accidental noise. I opened my eyes and stopped looking at the walls and the tools. I started looking at the floor. The basement floor was a solid slab of poured concrete painted with a durable gray epoxy finish. I had painted it myself 10 years ago. It was tough, designed to withstand dropped hammers and spilled chemicals. I dropped down to my hands and knees. My old joints screamed in protest, but I ignored the pain. I began to crawl systematically across the floor, keeping my face just a few inches from the gray surface. I looked for footprints. I looked for dragged dirt. I looked for the rust-red clay I had seen on her shoe upstairs. She had clearly swept the floor before she left. The surface was mostly clean, free of the usual thin layer of stray sawdust that usually covered it. But a broom cannot erase everything. A broom only clears the loose debris. It cannot fix structural damage. I crawled past the table saw and approached the far corner of the basement. This was the area where I kept my main heavy-duty workbench. It was a massive piece of furniture, built from solid maple and bolted directly to the wall. At least it was supposed to be bolted to the wall. I stopped and stared at the base of the maple legs. The bench looked perfectly normal from a distance. It was tucked snugly into the corner. But from down here, on my hands and knees, with my face inches from the ground, the deception was glaringly obvious. The thick metal brackets that were supposed to anchor the legs to the concrete foundation were missing their heavy lag bolts. The bolts had been completely removed. I squinted, pulling my small flashlight from my pocket and clicking it on. I shined the tight beam of white light directly onto the gray epoxy floor, just in front of the front left leg of the workbench. There it was. It was a tiny detail, but to an inspector it was as loud as a siren. A sharp, distinct scratch mark gouged deeply into the tough gray epoxy paint. It was a fresh wound in the floor, revealing the pale, raw concrete underneath. The scratch was about 3 inches long, curving in a slight arc away from the wall. The heavy workbench had not just been unbolted. It had been dragged outward, swung open, and shoved back. I stared at the scratch mark on the concrete floor, my heart pounding a slow rhythm against my ribs. The maple workbench, a piece of furniture I had built with my own hands to withstand heavy engine blocks, had been turned into a secret door. I pushed myself up, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through my joints. I placed my hands flat against the thick wooden edge. I took a deep breath, braced my boots against the floor, and pushed. It was incredibly heavy, designed to stay perfectly still. But fear and adrenaline are powerful things. I leaned my entire 70-year-old frame into the wood, gritting my teeth as the muscles in my back screamed in protest. With a harsh scrape that echoed loudly in the silent basement, the workbench slid forward. I kept pushing, angling it away from the corner, tracing the exact path of the scratch mark I had found. A damp, stale smell immediately drifted up from the exposed floor. I stepped back, panting heavily, and shined my flashlight into the hidden corner. A square metal grate sat in the concrete. It was an old floor drain I had installed decades ago to prevent flooding. But the cast iron cover, which should have been bolted flush with the floor, sat slightly crooked. Its screws were completely missing. I dropped to my knees, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans. I wedged my fingers under the heavy iron grate and pulled it up. It lifted easily, sliding away to reveal the dark pipe beneath. The stench grew stronger. It was a sickening mixture of stagnant water mold and harsh chemicals. I leaned over the open drain and shined my flashlight down the hole. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick plastic pipe that dropped straight down before curving away toward the main sewer line. Resting right at the bend of the pipe, snagged on a buildup of old dirt and lint, were 2 objects. They were small, seemingly insignificant things, but seeing them hidden in a secret drain under a heavy workbench made my stomach twist violently. I rolled up the sleeve of my flannel shirt, took a deep breath, and shoved my arm down into the narrow, filthy pipe. The rough plastic scraped against my skin, but I reached down until my fingertips brushed against the objects. I grabbed the first one, pulling it up out of the darkness and into the harsh fluorescent light of the basement. I sat back on my heels, opening my hand. Resting in my dirty palm was a baby pacifier. It was a cheap brand made of pale blue plastic with a clear silicone nipple. It looked incredibly small, resting in my large, calloused hand. For a fleeting second, my mind tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself that maybe a neighbor child had dropped it in the yard, and somehow it had washed down here. But then I looked closer. The silicone nipple was completely bitten through, shredded by tiny teeth in a moment of sheer panic or pain. And crusted around the plastic base, turning the pale blue material into a dark, rusty brown, was dried blood. A wave of pure physical nausea hit me so hard, I had to put my other hand on the floor to steady myself. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to vomit. Blood on a pacifier. Blood on a device meant to soothe a crying infant. The image of those limp, bundled shapes Natalie had dragged out of her SUV flashed behind my eyelids. I heard Gary complaining about muffled crying and thumping against the walls. My mind pictured a terrified toddler gagged with a pacifier, biting through the silicone in terror while their gums bled. The horror was suffocating. I had spent my life protecting my family, building a safe haven, and now the darkest form of evil was operating directly beneath my living room. My hand shook uncontrollably as I set the ruined, bloody pacifier on the concrete floor. I did not want to reach back down into that drain. I wanted to run up the stairs, lock the door, and call the police. I wanted someone else to carry the burden of this nightmare. But the responsibility was mine. This was my house. This was my daughter. I had to know the full extent of the truth. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, leaned back over the hole, and plunged my arm down into the pipe a second time. My fingers found the second object. It was a crumpled piece of paper, damp from the humidity of the drain. I pulled it out carefully, unrolling the delicate, wrinkled material. It was a long receipt printed on cheap thermal paper. The ink was slightly faded, but the harsh light of my flashlight revealed the text clearly. It was from a wholesale pharmacy supply warehouse located on the outskirts of the city. I scanned the list of purchased items, my eyes locking onto the single massive transaction printed at the bottom. 50 bottles of pediatric sedative syrup. I read the words again, my brain struggling to process the sheer volume of the order. 50 bottles. This was not a mild, over-the-counter sleeping aid. This was a heavy, industrial-strength sedative meant to knock out children before major medical procedures. It was a drug that could easily cause respiratory failure in a small child if the dosage was miscalculated. And my daughter had bought 50 bottles of it. I sat in the cold, silent basement, the damp receipt trembling in my fingers. The final pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening finality. The red clay on her shoes. The children smuggled in the dead of night. The bloody pacifier hidden in a drain. The massive supply of dangerous medical sedatives. This was not an illegal, unlicensed daycare center. You do not drug 50 children just to babysit them. You do not hide them in a soundproof basement in the middle of the night. This was a systematic, highly organized trafficking operation. She was moving human cargo. She was keeping them silent, keeping them unconscious, and hiding them in the one place no one would ever think to look. The home of a respected, retired old man. As I stared at the dried blood on the pacifier, the crushing weight of sorrow began to harden. It compressed under immense pressure until it transformed into a freezing, absolute rage. It was a cold anger devoid of any panic or hesitation. It was the calculated fury of an old man who has nothing left to lose. I was no longer a victim discovering a crime. I was an inspector preparing to demolish a condemned building. I needed to build a trap so perfect, so inescapable that she would never see the light of day again. I walked toward the stairs, my heart beating with a steady, lethal calm, ready to go to war. I reached the top of the wooden stairs, my boots heavy against the floorboards. The kitchen felt entirely alien now, bathed in the soft morning sunlight that seemed to mock the darkness below. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline flooding my system. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated harsh against my tired eyes. I opened the keypad. My thumb hovered over the 9. I pressed it. I pressed the 1. I was a second away from bringing an army of police cruisers to my front door. I wanted the flashing lights. I wanted the loud sirens. I wanted officers with badges and guns to swarm the property, secure the perimeter, and take this agonizing burden off my shoulders. I wanted to sit in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a blanket, while someone else handled the terrifying reality of what my daughter had become. But then the analytical mind of a construction inspector slammed the brakes on my panic. I stared at the numbers on the screen. If the police arrived right now, what exactly would they find? They would find an empty basement, a hidden drain, a bloody pacifier, and a receipt for sedatives. And who does that basement belong to? Richard Stanton. Whose name is on the mortgage? Richard Stanton. Who pays the electric bill for the heavy fluorescent lights down there? Richard Stanton. I lowered the phone slowly, the blood draining from my face as the true brilliance of Natalie's plan began to unfold in my mind. She was not just using my house because it was convenient or private. She was using it because I was the perfect, unsuspecting fall guy. If the police raided this property today, she would immediately deny everything. She would cry. She would play the devastated daughter beautifully. She would tell the detectives her father was suffering from severe dementia, that he was isolated and acting strangely for months. The red clay on her shoes would vanish. The black SUV would be scrubbed clean. I would be arrested before the sun went down, charged with unimaginable federal crimes, and left to rot in a prison cell while she walked away with my entire estate. I deleted the numbers from my screen. A simple phone call was not going to save me. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I turned around and walked straight back down the stairs into the basement. I moved with mechanical precision, forcefully shutting off every single emotion. I walked over to the exposed floor drain. I took the damp, crusted pacifier and the wrinkled pharmacy receipt and placed them exactly where I had found them, snagged perfectly on the buildup of dirt at the bend of the plastic pipe. I carefully lifted the heavy cast-iron grate and fitted it back into its crooked position. I wiped my hands on my jeans, stood up, and placed my palms against the edge of the solid maple workbench. I pushed it backward, aligning the heavy wooden legs seamlessly over the scratch mark on the epoxy floor. I spent 10 long minutes meticulously sweeping the area, redistributing the faint layer of sawdust to erase any sign that my boots had disturbed the space. When I was finished, the basement looked exactly as she had left it. It was a pristine, undisturbed lie. I walked upstairs, locked the interior door, and headed into my home office. It was time to call in a favor. During my 40 years of inspecting commercial construction sites, I had dealt with a lot of shady contractors. When expensive materials started disappearing from high-value sites, I did not call the police right away. I called a man named Marcus. Marcus was an independent security technician. He specialized in covert high-definition surveillance for corporate clients who needed to catch thieves in the act without tipping them off. He was incredibly expensive. He was strictly discreet, and he never asked unnecessary questions about the motivations of his employers. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, pulled a worn leather address book from the bottom drawer, and dialed his private number. It rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. I told him who I was, and I told him I had a major structural issue that required immediate specialized attention. Marcus instantly understood the code. He told me he could be at my property in exactly 2 hours, with a full suite of infrared motion, activated microcameras. I gave him strict instructions. I told him to park his unmarked work van 2 streets over and walk through the dense woods behind my house so none of the neighbors would see him arriving. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my leather chair. The trap was finally beginning to take shape. But installing the cameras was only the first step of the operation. Cameras could record the crime, but they could not stop it if things went terribly wrong. I needed to be here hidden deep in the shadows, ready to act if those children were in immediate physical danger. I needed to manually monitor the live feed, gather the audio confessions, and compile the evidence into a devastating package for the authorities. It was a massive risk, but it was the only way to guarantee that she would face the absolute maximum penalty under the harsh light of federal law. But Natalie was cautious. She actively monitored my movements. She brought me poisoned tea to ensure I was completely incapacitated. If I suddenly stopped drinking the tea, or if I changed my evening routine in any noticeable way, she would immediately become suspicious. She would smell the trap before she even stepped foot into the house. I stood up from my desk and looked out the window at the quiet suburban street bathed in sunlight. The only way to make her comfortable enough to bring the entire operation into the light was to remove the threat entirely. I needed to convince my daughter that the house was completely empty. I needed to give her a massive window of absolute freedom, a period where she firmly believed she had total control over my property. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the phone again, and slowly dialed Natalie's real estate office number. I stood by the marble counter, staring blankly at the wall, listening to the steady ringing on the line. I took a deep, calculated breath, carefully practicing the warm, unsuspecting tone of a tired old father. I was going to lie to her just as smoothly as she had lied to me. I was going to tell her that my brief weekend trip was simply not relaxing enough for my aching joints. I was going to tell her that I was packing my bags today, renting a remote, isolated cabin up north, and leaving town for an extended fishing trip with my oldest buddies. I needed her to believe with absolute certainty that for the next 3 days and nights, she had the entire house all to herself. The trap was fully set. Marcus appeared at this edge of the tree line exactly 2 hours later. He did not drive up the street. He did not walk down the driveway. True to his word, he had parked his unmarked utility van several streets over and hiked through the dense, overgrown woods that bordered the rear of my property. I watched from the kitchen window as he emerged from the heavy brush, carrying 2 large black protective cases. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed entirely in gray work clothes that blended seamlessly into the shadows. I unlocked the back patio door and let him inside. We did not exchange any pleasantries. We did not shake hands. Marcus was a professional who understood that when a man like me called him in on a Sunday morning, the situation was severe. I led him down the interior hallway, opened the door to the basement stairs, and pointed down into the darkness. He carried his heavy cases down the wooden steps, his heavy boots making almost no sound. When we reached the concrete floor, I turned on the fluorescent lights. Marcus set his cases on the maple workbench, popped the latches, and opened them. Inside was a fortune in specialized surveillance equipment. There were spools of microscopic wire high-capacity digital storage drives and a dozen tiny specialized cameras. These were not the bulky security cameras you see mounted on the ceilings of retail stores. These were military-grade infrared microlenses, no larger than the head of a pin. They were designed to see in pitch-black conditions, capturing high-definition video and crystal-clear audio without emitting a single glowing light or sound. I told Marcus I needed complete overlapping coverage of the entire basement. I needed to see the entrance door, the center floor space, the hidden floor drain, and the stairs leading up to the main house. There could be absolutely no blind spots. The installation process took 6 agonizing hours. It was a masterclass in covert engineering. Marcus worked with the silent clinical precision of a surgeon. Because I had built this basement myself, I knew exactly where the studs were, how the drywall was hung, and where the electrical conduits ran. Together, we dismantled the standard electrical outlets along the baseboards. Marcus carefully drilled microscopic holes into the plastic faceplates, threading the tiny camera lenses through the openings, so they were perfectly flush and completely invisible to the naked eye. We ran the hair-thin wires behind the drywall, utilizing the existing pathways I had built decades ago. For the overhead angles, we removed the metal ventilation grates near the ceiling. Marcus nestled the cameras deep inside the aluminum ductwork, angling them perfectly before screwing the grates back into place. Every single wire was routed back to a concealed, battery-powered digital transmitter hidden inside a hollowed-out space behind my main electrical breaker box. It was physically exhausting work. My shoulders burned from reaching overhead, and my knees throbbed from kneeling on the hard epoxy floor. But I did not stop. I pushed through the pain driven by a cold, singular focus. We swept up every speck of drywall dust. We wiped down every surface we touched to remove our fingerprints. We made sure every single tool and box on the storage shelves was returned to its exact original position. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the physical installation was complete. The basement looked completely unchanged. It was still the quiet, dusty, forgotten workshop of an old retired man. But underneath the surface, it was now a heavily wired, inescapable trap. Marcus closed his empty cases and handed me a sleek black tablet. He tapped the screen, entering a secure password, and handed it over to me. "This is the central hub," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "It is running on a localized, encrypted cellular network. It does not touch your home internet. No one can hack it, and no one can detect the signal. You have 6 separate camera feeds. They are all equipped with motion sensors and infrared night vision. The moment anyone opens that heavy steel door, the system will start recording directly to a secure cloud server, and this tablet will immediately alert you." I took the tablet in my hands. The screen was divided into 6 separate squares. I looked down at the glowing monitor, and a fresh wave of heartbreak washed over me. The high-definition black and white infrared feeds provided a haunting, ghostly view of the room I was standing in. Through the sterile lenses of the cameras, the basement looked completely alien. It did not look like my home anymore. It looked like a prison cell. I stared at the feed, showing the center of the room, the empty concrete floor right in front of the table saw. My mind drifted backward, pulled into a memory that felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. 30 years ago, this exact spot was covered in thick, fragrant curls of pine sawdust. I remembered standing there in my worn denim overalls, the loud whine of the sander echoing off the walls. I had spent 4 months down here working every evening after my shift at the construction site building a wooden rocking horse for Natalie's 3rd birthday. I remembered the smell of the wood glue. I remembered the meticulous care I took in sanding down every rough edge, ensuring it was perfectly smooth so my little girl would never get a splinter. I remembered the morning I carried it upstairs, watching her eyes light up with pure, unadulterated joy. She had hugged my legs so tightly, looking up at me as if I were a superhero who had hung the moon in the sky just for her. Now looking at the tablet, that beautiful memory was poisoned. That same little girl was going to walk into this very room, stand on this very floor, and use the sanctuary I built for her to drug and imprison innocent children. She was going to drag them across the same concrete where her rocking horse used to sit. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply rooted in the foundation of my life, that it physically hurt to breathe. I swallowed hard, forcing the tears back down. There was no room for mourning right now. Mourning could come later, after the monsters were locked away in cages. Marcus packed up the last of his gear and gave me a curt nod. He did not ask what I was planning to catch on those cameras. He simply turned around and walked back up the stairs, exiting through the back patio door and disappearing into the dense woods the exact same way he had arrived. I was completely alone again. The house was entirely silent. I sat down on the bottom step of the wooden staircase, holding the glowing tablet in my lap. The trap was wired perfectly. I had the evidence-gathering machine ready to go. I could easily pack my bags, drive to a motel 2 towns over, and watch the entire horrific scene unfold from the safety of a rented room. I could just hit a button and email the recorded files to the police. But as I stared at the empty, shadowy floor on the screen, a terrifying realization paralyzed me. Video evidence is incredibly powerful for securing a conviction in a courtroom. It is perfect for sending someone to federal prison. But video evidence cannot reach through a screen and perform CPR. Video evidence cannot stop a panicked woman from lashing out at a crying toddler. I remembered the sheer volume of pediatric sedative syrup listed on that pharmacy receipt. 50 bottles. If Natalie made a mistake calculating a dosage if one of those small children stopped breathing in the middle of the night, calling the police from a motel room would be utterly useless. By the time a squad car arrived, breached the heavy steel door, and navigated the basement, it would be far too late. A child would die on my concrete floor while I watched helplessly through a high-definition camera. My breath caught in my throat. The cold logic of the situation settled over me like a heavy iron blanket. Passive observation was not an option. I could not leave the house. I could not go to a motel. If I wanted to guarantee the safety of those innocent children, I had to be close enough to intervene the very second things went wrong. I had to be inside the trap with them. I needed a vantage point. I needed a place where I could remain entirely unseen, watching the live feeds, holding my weapon ready to burst out of the shadows if a life was in immediate jeopardy. I looked up from the tablet, scanning the dark corners of the basement, searching for the perfect place to hide. I scanned the dark corners of the basement, searching for the perfect place to hide. My eyes landed on the reinforced door of the cold storage pantry, tucked beneath the main staircase. It was a tiny windowless room originally built to store canned goods and root vegetables during the harsh Pennsylvania winters. I had lined the interior walls with thick foam insulation years ago to regulate the temperature. It was completely soundproof, securely hidden from the main floor, and equipped with a heavy internal deadbolt. It was the perfect blind for a hunter. I walked over, opened the heavy door, and placed the black tablet on the wooden shelf inside. I would return here tonight. But first I had to set the bait. I walked back up the stairs, locked the basement door, and moved into the kitchen. I picked up the telephone from the wall mount and dialed the number for my daughter's real estate office. The line rang 3 times before her assistant transferred me. When Natalie answered, her voice was sharp, professional, and slightly breathless, exactly what you would expect from a successful agent closing a major deal. "Natalie, sweetheart," I said, "I have made a sudden decision. That little golf trip over the weekend just did not do the trick for my aching bones. I need some real time away from this empty house. I just got off the phone with my old friend Thomas. He rented a beautiful cabin up near Lake Erie for the week, and he invited me to come up and do some fishing. I am going to head out this afternoon, and I will be gone for at least 3 days." I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she calculated the enormous, unexpected opportunity I was handing her. When she finally spoke, the sharp edge of her professional tone had completely vanished, replaced by a smooth, sugary warmth that made my stomach churn. "Dad, that is a wonderful idea," she said, her voice dripping with artificial relief. "You absolutely deserve a longer break. Let me come over right now and help you pack your truck. I want to see you off properly." I told her I would be waiting. I hung up the phone and immediately went to work constructing the illusion. I pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the hall closet and stuffed it with heavy winter sweaters, waterproof boots, and thick thermal socks. I carried it out to the driveway and tossed it into the bed of my pickup truck. I went to the garage and retrieved my old fiberglass tackle box, a heavy cooler, and 2 long fishing rods, carefully arranging them in the back of the truck so they were highly visible from the street. I needed the stage to be set perfectly. I needed her to see the tangible proof of my departure the moment she pulled up to the house. 30 minutes later, her sleek black SUV turned the corner and glided down the street. It was the exact same vehicle I had watched creeping through the shadows at 2 in the morning. She parked at the top of the driveway and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. She looked immaculate in a tailored gray suit, holding a cup of expensive coffee. To any neighbor watching from their window, she was the picture of a devoted, loving daughter, taking time out of her busy schedule to see her elderly father. But I was not looking at my daughter anymore. I was looking at a predator standing on my property. I walked down the concrete steps to meet her. She smiled warmly, her eyes scanning the fishing gear loaded in the back of the truck. You are really packed for a serious trip, Dad, she said, leaning against the side of the truck. Are you sure you are going to be okay driving all that way by yourself? You know I worry about you out on the highway alone. I looked at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I will be fine, Natalie. Sometimes a man just needs to get away from his own house. Sometimes you have to step back and look at things from a distance to see them clearly. I held her gaze for a second longer than normal. She simply nodded in agreement, taking a small sip of her coffee. You are absolutely right, Dad. The fresh air will do you a lot of good. Just promise me you will relax. Leave the house repairs and the worries behind. Let me handle absolutely everything here. I smiled, a tight, painful stretching of my lips. Oh, I intend to, sweetheart, I replied softly. I am going to use this time to figure out how to clean out the rot. I have realized that when something is broken deep down in the foundation, you cannot just paint over it. You have to tear it out completely, no matter how much it hurts, and start fresh. Natalie tilted her head slightly, a brief flicker of confusion crossing her perfect features, but she quickly dismissed it. Well, do not think about construction work while you are fishing. She laughed lightly. Just enjoy the water. Call me when you get to the cabin so I know you arrived safely. It was time to go. The performance was draining my strength. I stepped closer to her, wrapping my arms around her shoulders in a tight embrace. As I pulled her against my chest, the scent of her expensive vanilla perfume washed over me instantly, mixing in my mind with the horrific smell of the damp, rusty blood on that pacifier. She hugged me back, resting her chin on my shoulder, completely unaware that she was embracing the man who was about to destroy her entire life. It was a terrifying, heartbreaking moment. I closed my eyes, realizing with absolute certainty that this was the very last time I would ever hold her as a father holds a child. When I return to this house, she will be an enemy. I let go of her, stepping back and pulling the keys from my pocket. I climbed into the driver's seat of the truck, the engine roaring to life with a turn of the ignition. I rolled down the window and gave her one final nod. Goodbye, Natalie, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Take good care of the house while I am gone. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the driveway, merging onto the quiet suburban street. I did not look back out of the window. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. But as I reached the stop sign at the end of the block, I glanced up into the rearview mirror. I watched her standing there in the driveway, waving enthusiastically as my truck disappeared from view. And then the moment she thought I was completely gone, her hand dropped. Her smile instantly vanished, and she immediately pulled her phone from her pocket, rapidly dialing a number to call the monsters into my home. The trap was now left wide open. The endgame had officially begun. The darkness inside the cold storage pantry was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating blackness that pressed against my eyes, making no difference whether they were open or closed. The only source of light was the pale, ghostly blue glow emanating from the tablet, resting on the wooden shelf in front of me. I sat perfectly still on the small canvas folding stool I had brought down from the garage earlier that afternoon. To my left sat a steel thermos filled with ice water. To my right, resting directly beside the glowing screen, was my registered .38 caliber revolver. The heavy steel of the gun looked entirely out of place, sitting on a shelf designed for jars of homemade peach preserves and pickled green beans. The air in the tiny room was incredibly still, smelling faintly of dry earth, old cedar wood, and the metallic tang of the gun oil I had used to clean my weapon before leaving for the supermarket. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and stared intensely at the 6 split screens on the tablet. The basement outside my reinforced door was completely empty, rendered in sharp monochromatic infrared contrast. Everything was frozen in place. The long, agonizing wait had officially begun. For the first 2 hours, the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept my mind razor-sharp and my body rigid with anticipation. I was a coiled spring ready to react at the slightest fluctuation on the glowing monitors. But as the grandfather clock upstairs chimed 9 o'clock, the initial rush of energy began to fade, replaced by a creeping, deep-seated ache in my bones. I am a 70-year-old man. My body has spent 4 decades climbing steel scaffolding, crawling under concrete foundations, and carrying heavy loads across uneven terrain. My joints are worn down, stripped of their cartilage, and highly intolerant of being confined to a cramped, unmoving position in a freezing room. The cold from the uninsulated foundation wall began to seep through my heavy jacket, sinking directly into my spine. My knees throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain, begging me to stand up and stretch my legs. But I could not move. The floorboards in this tiny pantry were old and untested. A single creak, a single shift of my weight could reverberate through the quiet basement and destroy the entire operation. I forced myself to remain completely static. I focused on my breathing, drawing the cold air into my lungs in slow, measured counts to keep my heart rate steady. I took tiny, agonizingly slow sips from my thermos, letting the ice water numb my throat to prevent any sudden urge to cough. The silence of the house became its own kind of psychological torture. Without the hum of a television, the sound of passing cars, or the rustling of the wind outside my ears desperately searched for input. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the tablet screen. I could hear the sluggish thumping of my own heart echoing in my ears. I could hear the house settling above me, the old timber beams groaning softly under the weight of the heavy shingled roof. Every single creak made my hand instinctively jump toward the heavy grip of the revolver, my finger hovering just outside the trigger guard. The tension was immense, wrapping around my chest like a tight iron band. By 10:30, a new unforeseen anxiety began to gnaw at the edges of my sanity. The battery indicator in the top right corner of the tablet screen was slowly, steadily draining. When I first locked myself in the pantry, the small digital icon showed 98%. Now it had slipped down to 42%. The continuous streaming of 6 high-definition infrared video feeds was demanding an enormous amount of processing power. It was pulling data relentlessly, eating away at the limited lifespan of the device. I watched the number drop to 41. It felt like watching sand pour through an hourglass. If that battery died before Natalie and her accomplices arrived, I would be completely blind. I would be locked inside a dark box, unable to see the hostages, unable to monitor the weapons, and unable to gather the crucial evidence needed to put my daughter behind bars. I reached out and carefully dimmed the brightness of the screen to its lowest possible setting, hoping to conserve whatever precious power remained. The ghostly images of the basement grew darker, forcing me to lean even closer to the glass to decipher the shapes in the room. The physical discomfort and the draining battery created a perfect storm of mental torment. Trapped in the dark, my mind began to wander back to the past, searching for the warning signs I must have missed. How does a father raise a monster without noticing the fangs? I thought about her childhood. I thought about the time she cried for 3 days because she accidentally stepped on a baby bird in the driveway. I thought about the way she used to hold my hand so tightly whenever we walked through a crowded hardware store, looking up at me with absolute trust. Where did that profound empathy go? When did the loving daughter I knew die? And when did this cold, calculating criminal take her place? Was it the relentless pressure of her high-stakes corporate job? Was it the influence of the man with the tattoos she brought to the house last night? Or was the darkness always there, buried deep in her DNA, quietly waiting for the right opportunity to surface? The guilt threatened to overwhelm me. If I had been a more observant father, if I had paid closer attention to the subtle shifts in her personality over the last few years, maybe I could have stopped this before innocent children were dragged into her terrifying web. The bitter taste of failure rose in the back of my throat, but I forced it down. Tonight was not about my failure as a father. Tonight was about my duty as a protector. I checked the digital clock on the tablet. 11:15. The battery was at 29%. The temperature in the pantry had dropped significantly, and my breath was now forming faint white clouds in the dim light of the screen. My legs were completely numb from the knees down. I slowly uncurled my stiff fingers, opening and closing my hands to force the blood back into my extremities. I needed my hands to be steady. If I had to pull the heavy double-action trigger of my revolver, I could not afford to miss. I picked up the gun, feeling the cold, checkered wooden grip bite into my palm. I checked the cylinder by feel in the dark, my thumb tracing the smooth brass primers of the 6 loaded cartridges. I clicked the cylinder back into place and rested the heavy barrel on the wooden shelf, pointing it directly at the reinforced door of the pantry. The minutes stretched into hours. Every second felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered, terrified to blink in case I missed the first sign of movement. 11:20. 11:25. The battery hit 22%. The silence in the basement was absolute, a heavy vacuum waiting to be broken. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. I held my breath. At exactly 11:30, the digital numbers on the screen shifted. And then it finally happened. The heavy steel security door at the far end of the basement suddenly filled the frame of the primary camera. A bright, glaring green light flashed on the electronic keypad as someone outside rapidly entered my private code. The heavy silence of the house was violently shattered by the loud mechanical clank of the steel deadbolt retracting. The massive door groaned loudly on its hinges, swinging outward into the humid night air. Through the infrared lens, a thick rush of warm air distorted the image for a fraction of a second. And then the heavy rhythmic thud of work boots echoed loudly across the concrete floor. They were here. 2 figures stepped into the harsh infrared light of the primary camera feed. The first was Natalie. She was dressed in the same dark, unassuming clothes she wore earlier, her hair pulled back tightly. But the second figure was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, heavily built, and covered in thick, dark tattoos that snaked up his neck and disappeared beneath the collar of his black shirt. His head was shaved, and his movements were jerky, carrying a tense, aggressive energy. This was the man who had accompanied her last night. This was Derek. I watched through the glowing screen as they stepped fully into the basement, but my attention was instantly torn away from them. Behind Derek, shuffling out of the shadows of the doorway, was a sight that made the blood freeze in my veins. They were leading a line of small children. One by one, the toddlers emerged from the darkness of the driveway and stumbled onto the cold, concrete floor of my basement. There were 6 of them in total. Through the grainy black and white feed of the infrared camera, they looked like tiny, fragile ghosts. They were wearing ragged, oversized clothing that looked like it had not been washed in weeks. Some wore thin t-shirts, while others wore stained, mismatched pajamas. None of them were wearing shoes. Their small, bare feet dragged against the rough epoxy floor. But the most horrifying detail was not their clothing. It was their faces. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes widening in absolute horror. Their expressions were completely blank. Their eyes were half open, staring blankly ahead into the void, entirely glazed over and unfocused. Their small bodies swayed slightly as they stood there, struggling to maintain their balance. They were deeply, dangerously sedated. The pediatric syrup from the hidden pharmacy receipt was surging through their tiny veins, rendering them docile, silent, and completely helpless. A sickening wave of pure revulsion washed over me. I was sitting mere feet away from a nightmare. These children were heavily drugged, kidnapped in the middle of the night, and brought into my home to be hidden away like stolen cargo. The air in the tiny pantry suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I tightened my grip on the heavy revolver resting on the shelf, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to kick the door open and end this immediately. I wanted to put a bullet in the concrete right between Derek's combat boots. But I forced myself to remain completely still. I needed the audio evidence. I needed to know exactly what this operation was before I struck. On the screen, the horrific scene continued to unfold. Derek moved past the children, walking directly toward the center of the room. He did not look at them. He treated them as if they were pieces of broken furniture. Natalie stepped behind the line of toddlers, her face a mask of cold, calculated irritation. She reached out and began pushing them forward, her hands shoving against their small backs with unnecessary force. "Move along," she snapped, her voice coming through the tiny microphone of the tablet with terrifying clarity. "Stop dragging your feet." One of the children, a little boy who looked no older than 3, stumbled over his own bare feet. He fell forward, his knees hitting the hard concrete with a heavy thud. The sudden impact seemed to break through the thick haze of the sedatives. The little boy let out a sharp, pitiful whimper, his small hands clutching at his bruised knees. It was a weak, heartbreaking sound, the cry of a child who was terrified and in pain. What happened next shattered the last remaining fragment of the father I used to be. Natalie did not reach down to help him. She did not offer a word of comfort. Instead, her face twisted into an ugly snarl of pure rage. She lunged forward, grabbed the little boy by his thin upper arm, and yanked him violently up from the floor. The force of her pull lifted the child entirely off his feet. His small shoulder popped audibly through the audio feed. "Shut your mouth," she hissed, shaking him roughly before dropping him back onto his feet. "I told you to keep absolutely quiet. Do you want another dose of the medicine?" The little boy clamped his hands over his mouth, swallowing his cries in sheer terror. I sat in the pitch-black pantry, trembling with a murderous rage. The woman on that screen was not my daughter. She was a monster, devoid of a single ounce of human empathy, and she was operating inside the house I had built with my own hands. Derek ignored the interaction. He walked over to the solid maple workbench, the spot where I had found the hidden drain earlier that morning. He carried a heavy, dark canvas duffel bag slung over his broad shoulder. He unceremoniously dropped the bag onto the wooden surface. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet basement, momentarily drawing the glazed eyes of the sedated toddlers. Derek turned his back to the children and focused entirely on the bag. "Let us get this over with," Derek grumbled, his deep voice vibrating through the tablet speaker. "I hate keeping this much heat on me for this long. We need to count it and get out of here before the sun comes up." Natalie released her grip on the crying child and walked over to the workbench, her expression immediately shifting from cruel irritation to eager anticipation. She stood next to Derek, her eyes fixed on the canvas bag. "Open it," she commanded, her voice steady and greedy. "Let us see if they paid the full amount this month." Derek reached down and grabbed the heavy brass zipper of the duffel bag. With a swift, harsh pull, he yanked the zipper open, pulling the canvas apart to reveal the contents inside. Through the black and white infrared feed, the sight was completely unmistakable. The bag was packed to the absolute brim with tight, thick bundles of cash. They were stacks of $100 bills bound tightly together with thick rubber bands. Dozens of them piled haphazardly on top of one another represented an obscene wealth. The sheer volume of currency sitting on my old workbench was staggering. It was not just a few $1,000s. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a dirty duffel bag directly in front of 6 kidnapped, drugged, and terrified children. The scale of the criminal enterprise happening in my basement was far larger and far more lucrative than I could have ever imagined. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the final horrifying picture was still forming. They were not selling these children. They were using them. The money in that bag was the physical manifestation of pure human misery collected from desperate people in the dead of night. Derek reached into the bag, pulled out a thick stack of bills, and tossed it onto the wood. He pulled out another and then another. He tossed down a 4th stack, then a 5th. The heavy, muffled thuds of banded currency hitting the solid maple surface echoed through the tablet speaker, cutting through the eerie silence of the basement. I sat paralyzed in the cramped, freezing pantry, my thumb still resting against the cold steel of the revolver. I watched my daughter, a woman who made a lucrative living selling luxury real estate to wealthy developers, run her manicured fingers over the piles of dirty money. A sickening, greedy smile stretched across her face, completely transforming her features into something grotesque and unrecognizable. The contrast between the staggering wealth piled on that workbench and the 6 drugged, shivering toddlers standing barefoot on the concrete floor was a scene pulled straight from the darkest depths of hell. I strained my ears, pressing closer to the glowing screen, desperate to understand the mechanics of this nightmare. Where did all this money come from? What possible service was she providing to generate this kind of illicit cash in the middle of the night? The children were not moving. They stood perfectly still, their small chests rising and falling in shallow, sedated breaths, completely oblivious to the fortune resting just a few feet away from them. I spent my life trying to be a good man, yet here was the ultimate result. The sheer volume of cash sitting on my old woodworking bench was an absolute insult to every single drop of sweat I had ever poured into this house. The damp, earthy smell of the cold storage pantry seemed to thicken around me, suffocating my lungs as I waited for the monsters to speak. Derek leaned against the edge of the workbench, crossing his heavily tattooed arms over his broad chest. He looked down at the money, but his posture was rigid, laced with a nervous, unpredictable energy. He glanced over his shoulder at the line of sedated children, checking to make sure they were still docile, then turned his attention back to Natalie. "Did the new shift at the garment factory pay up on time?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a rough, impatient edge that vibrated through the small speaker of my tablet. I held my breath, the words hanging heavily in the tiny space of the pantry. The garment factory. There was a massive, windowless industrial complex on the far south side of the city, right in the heart of the district, where that rust-red clay on her shoes came from. It was notorious for operating around the clock, fueled by desperate, under-the-table labor. They are ghosts in the system trying to scrape together a few dollars to survive the week. Natalie let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. It was the exact same musical, effortless laugh she had used earlier that evening when telling me about Gary hallucinating on the front porch. "Of course they paid up, Derek," she said, picking up a thick stack of $100 bills and flipping through the edges with practiced, fluid ease. "They always pay. What other choice do they have? They are working the graveyard shift entirely off the books. They do not exist on paper. They have zero legal rights and zero protection." The puzzle pieces finally slammed together, completing a picture so depraved it defied human comprehension. She was not running an unlicensed daycare, and she was not trafficking these children to underground buyers. She was running a ruthless, highly calculated hostage extortion racket. Natalie tossed the stack of money back onto the growing pile and leaned back against the wooden bench, crossing her ankles. $3,000 ahead every single month, she stated, her voice dripping with absolute power and a sickening sense of superiority. "It is a brilliant tax on the invisible Derek. These people cross the border with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. They find grueling under-the-table work at the factory from midnight to dawn, but they have nowhere safe to leave their kids while they run the heavy sewing machines. So I step in. I offer them a mandatory service. I take the kids off their hands for the night, keep them entirely out of sight, and deliver them back to the alleyway behind the factory before the sun comes up." Derek shifted his weight uneasily, looking at the children again. His tattooed fingers drummed a frantic rhythm against his leg. "And if they refuse to pay the fee?" he asked, though the dark look in his eyes suggested he already knew the terrible answer to that question. Natalie smiled, a cold, dead expression that sent a literal shiver down my spine and made the blood freeze in my veins. "If they refuse to pay my fee, or if they even think about going to the local police, I make one anonymous phone call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The factory gets raided, the parents get deported back to whatever miserable country they crawled out of, and the kids go straight into the chaotic state foster system. They lose their children forever. They know I will do it, so they hand over the cash every single Friday without a word of complaint. It is the perfect business model. They are entirely trapped." I sat in the dark, my chest heaving, fighting the violent urge to vomit. She was preying on the most vulnerable, desperate people in the entire city. She was using the threat of deportation to extort thousands of dollars from parents who were just trying to survive holding their children hostage in a soundproof basement. And to ensure the operation ran smoothly, to ensure there was no crying, no playing, and no noise to alert the neighbors across the street, she was poisoning them. That is why you buy the syrup in bulk, Derek. She continued casually, gesturing vaguely toward the line of sedated toddlers with a manicured hand. You give them a heavy dose the second they get into the back of the vehicle. It keeps them quiet. It keeps them compliant. And it keeps the nosy neighbors from asking questions about strange noises in the middle of the night. They sleep the whole time they are down here, and the parents are too terrified of me to complain about how groggy their kids are the next day. It is completely foolproof. I stared at the screen, my grip on the heavy wooden handle of the revolver tightening until my muscles cramped. My own daughter was a monster, casually explaining her atrocities while standing over the victims. Derek, however, did not share her arrogant confidence. He did not smile. He reached out and aggressively shoved the thick piles of cash back into the dark canvas duffel bag, zipping it shut with a loud, harsh rip of the brass teeth. He was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting nervously toward the small, grated windows near the basement ceiling, as if he expected red and blue lights to flash through the glass. "It is not foolproof, Natalie," he muttered, his voice dropping to a tense, paranoid whisper that barely registered on the microphone. "What if the local cops ever traced the SUV?" Derek's paranoid question hung in the heavy, stale air of the basement, echoing faintly against the concrete walls. I watched the glowing screen of my tablet, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for my daughter to answer. For a long, agonizing moment, Natalie did not speak. She simply stood there, bathed in the harsh infrared light, her hands resting casually on the massive pile of illicit cash. Slowly, a smirk crawled across her face. It was not a smile of reassurance. It was a look of absolute, arrogant contempt. She let out a sharp, dismissive sigh and shook her head, looking at the heavily tattooed man as if he were a slow, uneducated child who had just asked a foolish question. "Let them trace the car, Derek," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling, hollow calm. "Let them trace the license plate. Let the local police come knocking. Let the federal agents show up with their battering rams and their search warrants. I honestly do not care." Derek took a step back, his broad shoulders tensing. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, gesturing frantically toward the line of sedated toddlers who were still swaying gently on their bare feet. "If the cops come through that steel door, we are looking at 20 years minimum. This is federal kidnapping. This is extortion. They will lock us in a deep hole and throw away the key." Natalie laughed. It was a cold, metallic sound that sliced right through the thick wooden door of the pantry and lodged itself directly into my heart. She turned her back on the children and began to pace slowly across the gray epoxy floor, her dark boots making soft, rhythmic thuds against the concrete. "We are not looking at anything, Derek," she corrected him, stopping right in front of the primary camera lens. "I am not looking at any prison time, and neither are you. Because if this operation ever gets compromised, if the authorities ever figure out what is happening down here, the blame will never touch us. It will fall entirely 100% on the owner of this property." She turned slowly, sweeping her arm across the room, presenting the basement as if it were a grand macabre stage she had designed. I sat in the pitch-black pantry, my grip on the heavy revolver tightening until my knuckles ached. I knew exactly what she was about to say, but hearing the words form in her mouth felt like being repeatedly stabbed in the chest with a rusted blade. "Think about it logically." She continued, her tone shifting into a smooth, practiced presentation, the same tone she used to sell million-dollar properties to wealthy clients. "Whose name is on the deed to this $2 million suburban estate, Richard Stanton? Whose name is on the utility bills that pay for these heavy-duty fluorescent lights? Richard Stanton, who installed the heavy steel security door, who wired the electronic keypad, who poured this concrete floor and built this massive wooden workbench where we are currently counting hundreds of thousands of dollars in dirty cash. She paused, letting the devastating reality of her setup wash over Derek. Everything in this room belongs to a 70-year-old man who lives alone, she said softly. If the police raid this house, they are not going to find my fingerprints on the structural elements. They will find his. They will find his DNA. They will find a hidden drain that he installed decades ago. And most importantly, they will find him sleeping upstairs in his master bedroom, completely oblivious to the world. Derek narrowed his eyes, the heavy tattoos on his neck shifting as he swallowed hard. But he is your father, Natalie. If they arrest him, he is going to talk. He is going to point the finger straight at you. He will tell them you brought the kids here. Natalie smiled again, a slow predatory stretching of her lips. Oh, I am counting on it, she whispered. I expect him to blame me. But it will not matter. Who are the police going to believe? Are they going to believe a highly successful, wealthy corporate real estate agent with a spotless criminal record and perfect credit, or are they going to believe a lonely, grieving old widower who has completely lost his grip on reality? I felt a freezing wave of nausea roll through my stomach. The puzzle was finally horrifyingly complete. The herbal tea she had been brewing for me over the last 3 months was not just a sedative to keep me asleep while she ran her extortion ring. It was the foundation of a carefully crafted narrative. I have spent the last 90 days planting seeds all over this neighborhood, she boasted, her voice laced with deep, sickening pride. I have been telling the neighbors that my father is suffering from rapid-onset dementia. I told the grumpy old veteran across the street that my dad wanders around the house at night, hallucinating, talking to people who are not there. I have been dropping hints to my colleagues at the agency that I am overwhelmed with the burden of caring for a father who is losing his mind. I even have medical records showing I inquired about placing him in a psychiatric care facility. She walked back to the workbench and casually picked up the blood-crusted pacifier that I had found hidden in the drain earlier that morning. She held it up to the light, turning it between her fingers. If the police interrogate him, he will sound exactly like a crazy old man trying to frame his innocent daughter, she said coldly. He will be groggy from the tea. He will be disoriented. He will have absolutely no proof that I was ever down here. I will cry in the interrogation room. I will play the devastated, heartbroken daughter perfectly. I will tell the detectives that I had absolutely no idea my sick, twisted father was running a horrific abuse ring in his basement while I thought he was peacefully sleeping. Derek stared at her, a look of genuine, terrified awe spreading across his rough features. You really planned all of this out, he muttered. You set him up to take the entire fall. I did not just set him up to take the fall, Derek, she corrected him, tossing the bloody pacifier back onto the wooden bench. I set him up to die. The words echoed through the tablet speaker, ringing in the tiny dark pantry with a deafening finality. I stopped breathing. The cold air inside the tiny room seemed to solidify around me, pressing against my throat. A 70-year-old man facing multiple federal counts of kidnapping, extortion, and child abuse, she continued, her voice dropping to a harsh, ruthless whisper. The judge will deny bail immediately. He will be sent straight to a maximum security federal holding facility. Men like that, men accused of hurting young children, do not last long on the inside. The other inmates will tear him apart before his trial even begins, or his weak, aging heart will simply give out from the stress. Either way, he will die in prison within a year. She turned her back on Derek, looking directly toward the corner of the basement, where my pantry was hidden, though she had absolutely no idea I was sitting just on the other side of the wall. And when he dies, she said, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated greed, I am his only living relative. I inherit this massive, beautiful house. I inherit his retirement accounts. I get the entire $2 million estate completely free and clear without paying a single dime in nursing home fees. This extortion money is just the weekly paycheck. The death of my father is the grand prize. Inside the cramped, freezing darkness of the cold storage pantry, the man named Richard Stanton quietly passed away. The father who had taught that little girl how to ride a bicycle in the driveway died. The man who had spent 4 months painstakingly building a wooden rocking horse for her 3rd birthday died. The grieving widower who always left the porch light on for his daughter died. Every single ounce of love, compassion, and paternal instinct I had carried in my heart for 35 years evaporated into the cold, stale air. In his place, a completely different entity was born. I stared at the glowing tablet screen, looking at the face of the woman who had just gleefully outlined my execution. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute, and highly calculated desire for total destruction. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier were completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, mechanical focus. I was an inspector standing in a condemned building, and it was time to initiate the demolition. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy steel revolver from the wooden shelf. I checked the cylinder one last time by feel, ensuring the heavy brass cartridges were perfectly aligned. I set the gun back down and pressed my finger against the glowing screen of the tablet, pulling up the master control panel for the electronic security locks. The trap was fully loaded. The confession was recorded. The monsters had completely revealed themselves. It was time to close the iron cage. My hand rested on the glowing screen of the tablet, but my eyes were locked on the heavy steel revolver sitting just inches away. Every primal instinct buried deep inside my DNA screamed at me to pick up the weapon. I wanted to kick the heavy wooden door of the pantry open, step out into the harsh fluorescent light, and point that 6-inch barrel directly at my daughter. The urge for immediate physical violence was a living, breathing entity inside my chest, clawing at my ribs and demanding to be let out. It would be so easy. 2 trigger pulls and the monsters in my basement would cease to exist. But I am not a monster, and I am no longer a grieving father. I am a retired construction inspector, and my entire professional life was dedicated to preventing catastrophic collateral damage. I forced my eyes away from the gun and looked back at the screen. I looked at the 6 toddlers standing barefoot on the cold epoxy floor. They were swaying gently, deeply sedated, completely defenseless. If I stepped out of this pantry with a drawn weapon, the situation would instantly become chaotic. If he rushed me or if he pulled a weapon of his own, a firefight would erupt in a closed concrete room. The deafening echo of .38 caliber gunfire would shatter their eardrums. A stray bullet could easily ricochet off the heavy maple workbench or the poured concrete walls and strike an innocent toddler. I could not let my desire for personal vengeance put those children in the line of fire. They had already suffered enough at the hands of my bloodline. I had to protect them. I had to execute this demolition with absolute clinical precision. I pulled my hand away from the revolver and focused entirely on the tablet. The digital trap was far more lethal than any bullet. I tapped the screen, navigating away from the live camera feeds and opening the secured data vault that Marcus had set up on the device. The localized cellular network was strong, operating entirely independent of the house internet that Natalie thought she controlled. I began the meticulous process of compiling the evidence. I operated the interface with a steady, unyielding focus, completely detached from the emotional horror of the files I was handling. I selected the high-definition infrared video showing Natalie carrying the limp, bundled children out of the black SUV. I selected the footage of her violently yanking the crying little boy by his arm, capturing the sickening sound of his shoulder popping. I grabbed the wide-angle shot of Derek unzipping the dark canvas duffel bag, revealing the massive, undeniable stacks of extortion money piled high on my woodworking bench. But the visual evidence was only half the guillotine. I needed the blade to be razor-sharp. I accessed the audio logs and extracted the clear, uninterrupted recording of their entire conversation. I highlighted the exact timestamps where Natalie openly confessed to running a hostage extortion racket against undocumented garment factory workers. I secured the clip where she proudly admitted to dosing the toddlers with heavy industrial pediatric sedatives. And finally, I clipped the audio of her ultimate betrayal. I saved the exact moment she laughed at the prospect of framing me, detailing her plan to let me die in a maximum security federal prison so she could inherit my $2 million estate, free and clear. It was the complete total destruction of her life neatly wrapped in a digital file. I gathered the video files, the audio clips, and the high-resolution still frames into a single encrypted folder. With the evidence perfectly compiled, I opened the encrypted email client on the tablet. I needed to ensure this explosion was contained and directed at the highest levels of authority. If I only called the local dispatch, a single patrol car might arrive, giving Derek a chance to fight or flee. I needed overwhelming force. I typed in the email address for Bradley, my personal attorney, and a man I had trusted for over 20 years. He knew my character well. I addressed the second recipient to the local police captain, a man I had occasionally played poker with at the Veteran Lodge. He would recognize my name immediately and understand the gravity of the message. Finally, I added the direct contact address for the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Human trafficking, federal extortion, and the transportation of illicit funds across state lines demanded federal intervention. I kept the subject line simple and direct. Emergency evidence of federal extortion and child endangerment in progress. I moved to the body of the email. I did not write a long emotional plea. I wrote with the cold, factual precision of a man filing a final inspection report. I stated my name, my exact address, and my current location hidden inside the basement pantry. I stated that there were 6 sedated children being held hostage by 2 armed individuals directly outside my door. I instructed them to bypass the front entrance entirely, warning them that the suspects had an escape vehicle parked in the blind spot of the driveway. I attached the massive encrypted folder containing every piece of audio and video evidence I had just compiled. I reviewed the email one last time, checking the recipient addresses and the attached files. Everything was perfect. There were no loopholes. There was no plausible lie Natalie could invent to explain away the high-definition reality contained in that folder. I looked up from the screen and stared through the digital feeds at my daughter. She was still standing by the workbench, casually running her hand over the stacks of $100 bills, completely oblivious to the massive invisible mechanism that was currently locking into place all around her. She believed she was the smartest person in the room. She believed she had outsmarted a clueless old man. She had no idea that the old man was sitting 10 feet away, holding the switch to the electric chair. I looked down at the glowing blue send button on the screen. My thumb hovered over it for a fraction of a second. This was the point of absolutely no return. Once I pressed this button, my daughter would be gone forever. She would be swallowed by the federal justice system, and I would never see her outside of a prison visiting room for the rest of my natural life. I took a deep, freezing breath of the stale pantry air. I did not hesitate. I firmly pressed the button. The tablet screen shifted. A small circular loading icon appeared in the center of the display, indicating the massive files were traveling through the encrypted cellular network. I watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%, 40%, then 80%. I held my breath, listening to the heavy thud of Derek pacing across the concrete floor outside. The progress bar reached the end. The screen flashed a bright, solid green. A soft, almost imperceptible chime sounded from the device. The notification pinged clearly across the top of the display. Files delivered. The glowing green notification on my tablet screen faded back into the stark black and white feeds of the security cameras. I lowered the device to my lap and leaned my head back against the cold, insulated wall of the pantry. The digital guillotine had officially dropped. Now I simply had to sit in the dark and wait for the heavy blade to reach their necks. On the screen, Natalie and Derek were completely unaware that their entire criminal empire had just been vaporized into a secure email server. They continued to count the thick stacks of $100 bills, dividing the dirty extortion money into neat, organized piles on my old maple woodworking bench. The 6 sedated toddlers remained completely motionless on the concrete floor, trapped deeply in their chemical slumber, completely ignorant of the massive fortune sitting just a few feet away. 5 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then 10 minutes. I began to worry that the emails had been trapped in a secure server filter or delayed by the encrypted network. But at exactly 11:45, a faint, high-pitched wail pierced the heavy silence of the night. It was incredibly distant at first, a tiny prickle of sound drifting through the small ventilation grates near the ceiling of the basement. But it grew louder with terrifying exponential speed. It was not just one single patrol car siren. It was a massive chorus of them overlapping and harmonizing into a deafening mechanical roar of approaching justice. The local police dispatch had coordinated with the federal field office just as I had hoped. An absolute army of law enforcement was descending upon my quiet suburban street. Down in the basement, the reaction to the noise was instantaneous. Derek froze in place, a thick stack of banded bills slipping from his heavily tattooed fingers and scattering across the gray epoxy floor. His head whipped toward the small rectangular windows near the ceiling. The flashing reflection of red and blue emergency lights began to stroke violently against the thick glass painting the dark yard outside in frantic, chaotic bursts of color. "They are here!" Derek choked out, his deep voice cracking with absolute raw panic. "The cops are here!" He spun around, his eyes wide and terrified, scanning the room like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had been shut. "We need to go right now. Leave the money, leave the kids. We have to run out the back before they block the street." Natalie dropped the cash she was holding, but her reaction was entirely different from his. She did not freeze, and she did not immediately bolt for the exit. Her profound greed completely overpowered her basic sense of self-preservation. She lunged forward, grabbing massive handfuls of the organized cash and aggressively shoving it back into the dark canvas duffel bag. "We are not leaving the money," she screamed over the rising wail of the sirens outside. "Grab the other bag. We take the cash, we leave the kids, and we take my vehicle. They do not know who is down here. We can slip out through the woods before they establish a full perimeter." "Move your feet, Derek." I watched the frantic, chaotic scene unfold on my tablet. They were acting like rats on a sinking ship, desperate to carry their stolen treasure down into the dark water with them. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the structural integrity of the trap they were standing inside. I picked up my mobile phone from the wooden shelf, my thumb hovering over the master control application for my home security system. When I installed the heavy steel exterior door at the bottom of the driveway years ago, I did not just install a simple electronic keypad. I wired a reinforced smart-enabled deadbolt system designed to withstand a massive amount of physical brute force. It was a lock meant to keep thieves out of my workshop, but tonight it was going to keep the monsters securely inside. Derek grabbed the heavy nylon handles of the canvas bag, hoisting the immense weight of the extortion money over his broad shoulder. He turned and sprinted toward the exterior door, his heavy combat boots slamming violently against the floor. Natalie was right behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically as she abandoned the sedated children without a single backward glance or ounce of hesitation. They reached the base of the short stairs leading to the steel door. Derek reached out, grabbing the heavy brass handle to push it open. I pressed my thumb firmly against the center of my phone screen. A loud mechanical clunk echoed through the basement. It was the heavy sound of a 2-inch thick solid steel rod sliding perfectly into a reinforced concrete strike plate. The deadbolt engaged instantly, permanently sealing the door from the outside. Derek yanked on the handle. The heavy door did not move a single millimeter. He grunted, dropping the heavy bag of money to the floor, and grabbed the handle with both hands. He planted his boots against the metal doorframe and pulled backward with all his massive tattooed strength. The steel door remained absolutely rigid, bolted securely into the foundation of my home. "It is locked!" Derek screamed, panic completely consuming his voice and turning it into a high-pitched rasp. "The keypad is completely dead. It is not taking the code." Natalie shoved him aside. Her face twisted in a mask of desperate feral fury. She punched the 6-digit code into the electronic pad over and over again, her fingers hammering against the plastic buttons. The small digital screen remained pitch black. The power to the lock mechanism had been completely severed by my remote command. "We are trapped," Derek yelled, spinning around to face the dark basement. He looked up at the ceiling, listening to the heavy screech of tires coming to a halt on the asphalt above. "They are going to breach. We are completely trapped down here." Natalie began to pound her bare fists against the unyielding steel, screaming in pure frustration. I sat in the freezing darkness of my tiny pantry, watching them break down on the glowing screen. The long, agonizing time for hiding was officially over. It was time for the architect of this prison to finally reveal himself. I opened a separate application on my phone connecting directly to the high-fidelity intercom speakers I had installed in the basement ceiling years ago. I held the phone close to my mouth, taking a slow, deep breath of the stale pantry air. I did not yell. I did not sound angry. I spoke with the calm, deadened voice of a ghost who had returned to settle a final bloody debt. "The tea was a bit weak today, Natalie." My voice boomed out of the ceiling speakers, amplified and echoing harshly off the concrete walls. It completely drowned out the wailing sirens outside. It was a sound of absolute, inescapable doom. On the tablet screen, the reaction was a masterpiece of psychological destruction. Natalie stopped pounding on the door instantly. She froze completely, her hands hovering mid-air. Slowly, mechanically, she turned around to face the empty basement. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified mannequin. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the dark shadows, desperately trying to understand how the foolish old father she had drugged and framed was suddenly speaking to her from the very walls of her dungeon. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a terror so profound it vibrated clearly through the sensitive microphone of the security cameras. "Where are you? How are you doing this?" I leaned closer to the phone, my eyes locked on her terrified face. "I am exactly where I need to be," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the room, stripping away every last ounce of her arrogant confidence. "I have watched every single second. I have recorded every single word. The federal agents have all of it, Natalie. The videos, the audio, the money. You are not framing me. You are not inheriting this house. You are never seeing the light of day again. You are buried." The absolute soul-crushing horror that washed over my daughter's face was a sight that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. Her knees buckled slightly as the crushing weight of her inescapable reality finally crashed down upon her shoulders. She had engineered the perfect, airtight crime, and her own father had silently dismantled it piece by piece from the shadows. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for mercy, perhaps to lie one final time, but the opportunity was violently stolen from her. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a solid steel battering ram smashing against the thick oak of my front door. Upstairs exploded through the house, shaking the entire concrete foundation and raining a fine mist of dust down upon their heads. The second strike of the battering ram shattered the doorframe completely. I heard the heavy splintering crack of the oak wood giving way, followed immediately by the chaotic thundering stampede of heavy tactical boots swarming across my hardwood floors. Orders were being shouted, crisp and authoritative, echoing down the interior hallway toward the basement stairs. On the tablet screen, Derek dropped to his knees, throwing his tattooed hands in the air, before the police even made it down the steps. He was a seasoned criminal, and he knew exactly what happened when you tried to fight a fully armed federal tactical unit. But Natalie was frozen. She stared at the interior staircase door as it was kicked open. A blinding array of mounted tactical flashlights pierced through the darkness of the stairway, cutting through the dusty air of the basement. A dozen heavily armored officers flooded into the room, their weapons drawn and leveled perfectly at the two targets. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency. Within seconds, Derek was slammed face first onto the gray epoxy floor, his arms wrenched behind his back and secured with heavy zip ties. The officers moved on Natalie next, grabbing her by the shoulders and forcing her against the maple workbench right next to the massive pile of extortion money she had been so desperate to keep. And right on cue, the performance began. Natalie burst into a hysterical, theatrical fit of sobbing. She let her knees buckle, acting as though she were a terrified, innocent victim caught in the middle of a nightmare. "Please, you have to listen to me," she screamed, her voice cracking with manufactured panic as the officers secured her wrists. "I did not do this. You have to find my father. He is an old man. His mind is completely gone. He locked us down here. Please, you have to help him. He does not know what he is doing." I sat in the dark pantry, listening to her weave the very lie she had promised Derek she would use. I slowly stood up from the small folding stool. My joints popped loudly in the confined space, but I did not care anymore. I picked up the glowing tablet from the wooden shelf, leaving the heavy revolver behind. I did not need a weapon anymore. I reached out, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the pantry door, and slid the deadbolt back. The sudden click drew the attention of 3 tactical officers. They instantly trained their blinding weapon lights on the dark corner beneath the stairs. "Come out slowly, with your hands empty," a commanding voice shouted. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out of the shadows, walking directly into the blinding glare of the tactical lights. I held my empty hands up, the tablet grasped lightly in my left palm. "I am Richard Stanton," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and steady. "I am the owner of this property. I am the one who sent the email to the field office. I am unarmed." The officers slowly lowered their weapons, parting slightly, to let me walk toward the center of the room. The moment Natalie saw me, her fake sobbing abruptly stopped. Her eyes widened, darting between the police officers and my calm, emotionless face. She tried to play her final desperate card. "Dad." She cried out, her voice trembling as she struggled against the plastic cuffs holding her to the workbench. "Dad, please tell them. Tell them you were just confused. Tell them about the tea. Tell them you do not know how these poor children got down here. Please, Daddy, tell them it is all a big misunderstanding." I stopped walking. I stood less than 5 feet away from her. The harsh fluorescent lights of the basement illuminated every single detail of her panicked, terrified face. She was begging me to save her, utilizing the title of father to try and manipulate the final shred of love she thought I still harbored. But there was nothing left to manipulate. The well was completely dry. I looked her dead in the eye. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I did not express a single ounce of disappointment, anger, or sorrow. I simply looked at her with the cold, hollow indifference one reserves for a complete stranger. Without saying a single word to her, I turned my head and looked at the police captain standing nearby. I extended my arm and handed him the glowing tablet. "Everything you need is right there, Captain," I said quietly. "The audio, the video, the financial confessions, the entire network." The captain took the tablet, his eyes scanning the frozen infrared footage on the screen, before looking back at me with a solemn nod of understanding. Natalie watched the exchange, the final remnants of her hope shattering into dust. She slumped against the heavy wooden bench, her head dropping in total, irreversible defeat. I turned my back on her and walked toward the stairs. The medical personnel were already rushing down with small blankets, carefully lifting the sedated children into their arms to carry them out into the fresh night air. I watched the toddlers go, a profound sense of relief finally washing over my tired bones. The basement was empty of its innocence, leaving only the guilty behind. The wheels of federal justice turn incredibly slowly, but when they finally crush you, they grind you into fine powder. Fast forward 6 months. I sat in the polished wooden pews of a federal courtroom, wearing my best suit, watching the sentencing hearing. The trial was practically non-existent. The encrypted digital evidence I had gathered in the dark was so utterly overwhelming, so perfectly damning, that no defense attorney in the state could build a case against it. Faced with the reality of the recordings, Derek turned state evidence almost immediately, giving up every single associate connected to the garment factory extortion ring. But there was no deal offered to the ringleader. The judge looked down from his high bench, his expression etched with absolute disgust. He delivered the sentence with a strike of his heavy wooden gavel. 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. No possibility of early parole. No chance for an appeal. I watched two federal marshals place the heavy chains around my daughter's wrists and ankles. She looked back at me one last time before they led her through the heavy wooden doors. Her face was pale, hollowed out by months of holding cell isolation. I did not blink. I did not wave. I simply sat there watching the monster leave my life forever. But locking away the bad does not automatically create good. You have to build the good yourself. I could not return to that house. The walls were infected. The foundation felt cursed. The memory of what happened in that basement stained every single room. I put the massive $2 million property on the market the very next morning, selling it well below market value to a corporate development firm just to wash my hands of it quickly. I took every single penny of that sale, combined it with my retirement savings, and drove straight to the industrial south side of the city. I purchased an abandoned single-story brick warehouse located less than a mile from the garment factory. I spent the next 8 months doing what I do best. I inspected, I reinforced, and I built. I transformed that empty shell into a bright, colorful 24-hour bilingual childcare center. I hired certified, compassionate staff, funded entirely by an irrevocable trust I established. It is a place where night shift immigrant workers can drop their children off safely, without paying a single dime, and without any fear of being reported or extorted. The children sleep in warm, comfortable beds surrounded by toys, light, and safety. Every night when I walk through those halls and hear the soft, peaceful breathing of innocent kids, the nightmares of my old basement finally fade away. They say that blood is thicker than water, and that family is the most important thing in a man's life. I used to believe that. I used to believe that you owed your undying loyalty to the people who shared your last name no matter what they did. But I learned the hardest lesson a father can ever learn. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just biology. True family is built on respect, on empathy, and on the fundamental desire to protect one another from the darkness of the world. When the rot gets deep into the foundation, you cannot save the house by ignoring the cracks. You have to have the courage to strike the match, burn down the infected structure, and start over from the ashes. I lost a daughter, but I saved my soul, and I protected those who could not protect themselves. Peace is not found in forgiving the unforgivable. Peace is found in ensuring they can never hurt anyone ever again.